Welcome to the fifth installment of the seven-part series, Timeline Earth, A Grand Narrative. This week we're going to be looking at the late age of industry. Let's zoom right in, shall we? In this particular time, we begin to see the barrier between humankind and the natural world close completely. So now nature becomes something to be exploited, maximized, and used for profit or personal gain. Unfortunately, in this country, for example, the statistics show that we spend about 95% of our time indoors. So not only this is a perceptual separation, it's an actual physical separation. And we also are going to see examples during this period where our separation from our ethical foundations is going to be quite clear and quite painful. Let's go forward and take a closer look. Every worldview shift, we look at the conditions for change. In this particular case, now we have fossil fuels, which are dramatically more powerful than harvesting water and or wind. And so we're looking at exponential growth in the amount of power that humanity has at its hands. We're looking at new communication technologies, and we're looking at climatic shifts. So let's go ahead and zoom in into our little timeline down here and see what's going on. I want to begin by actually talking about the undercurrent that I ended the last period with, which we ended with talking about Romanticism and the reaction to industrial development. And we see it continuing in New York City in 1858 with Frederick Law Olmsted's work in the Central Park. I think it was beginning to become clear that while everybody enjoyed the benefits of industry, that the impacts to the environment and to quality of life were beginning to be felt more clearly. And so Central Park was clearly a response to that. And we'll see lots of other examples like that during this period. Certainly coal would become a very powerful fossil fuel to be used. One, to fuel trains, for example, but also beginning to shift the way that labor was conceived from the need for humans using surplus food to do labor to using machines. And obviously this is a worldview shift which is going to have a lot of ramifications. Communications-wise, I put the train in there as one. Telegraph and telephone and television are all examples of how communication would greatly be facilitated by these technologies. The other thing that we're going to see in this period is advocacy or fighting for rights. So while we're going to see technological domination, we're also going to see large groups of segments of population trying to fight for equity, not equality necessarily, but just for equity. And certainly the early rebellions or early revolutions against slave trade were one of those examples. Interestingly enough, Darwin at this time was pretty influential, but not always for the same reason. It was clear to me and others in doing the research that survival of the fittest was a comment or a phrase that actually Darwin never came up with. Darwin was talking about the ability of species to fit into ecosystems, as in fittest, but capitalists and other robber barons use it as a justification for those that have the might have the right, and you'll see that throughout time that was misunderstood and misappropriated. The Civil War in the U.S. was probably one of the greatest examples and most horrific examples of one worldview shifting to another. So in the Civil War, we have the agrarian age, which is based on food energy and slavery, against the North, which was about fossil fuels and machinery and the industrial age. And the two fought it out in the most brutal war in the history of the U.S., with the North finally winning after literally hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of people died through that experience. In the end, the U.S. became an industrial power, obviously, and still, of course, the agricultural worldview existed underneath that. At the same time, the continued genocide and eradication of Native Americans was underway and continuing. And so we talk about the ethical core and how people and or governments can justify their behavior. And here, again, biological racism was used as a way to say, if we're superior from an ethnic point of view, we have the right then to remove people from their land. Probably one of the saddest days and the saddest times in the history of the U.S. history. I talked some more about the thread of this love of nature and the beginning of understanding that nature had intrinsic value of its own. This goes all the way back to the hunter-gatherers, who obviously had that kind of view. And John Muir and the Muir Woods back in the early 1900s was one of the people leading to the beginnings of protecting nature and saving parts of nature for humanity. And Teddy Roosevelt, who's not shown here, was the other character involved in this, who established many, many national monuments and state parks. So we're beginning to move to a parallel process where nature is being exploited at maximum value, and others are working hard to protect those areas of nature that have the most value. So there's sort of a duality that's occurring here in the early 20th century. Certainly with technological growth, the Wright brothers, Henry Ford, all had great innovations that occurred through increasingly abstract thinking. So for example, the first airplane certainly wasn't mimicking a bird in the way that it was flying. It was using some completely new technology that was pretty effective. And Henry Ford, of course, who develops the assembly line, finds ways to increase the speed of labor and efficiency of labor to the point where more and more wealth and more objects can be created. Henry Ford was relying on the establishment of a consumer culture, which today we still have in many parts of the world, which is a key ingredient to sustainability or unsustainability. I talk a lot about the impact of math and science on New World View, and while Newton had established a very consistent mechanistic view of the natural world, Einstein began to view the world, or discover that the world was actually a lot more complex and a lot less predictable than maybe Newton had thought. In fact, Einstein himself was troubled with his own discoveries and wanted to find a unified theory between what he was discovering in the theories of relativity and what Newton had portrayed or described earlier in a more predictable view of the universe. But the more that science moved forward, the more that mathematics moved forward, the more kinds of elements were discovered that were kind of a little bit strange and less easy to explain, like the wave-particle duality. And so what we're going to be seeing in the early 20th century is the opening up of science to a more complex, a more integrated, and a more deeper understanding of nature as being less predictable and perhaps more powerful than we might have imagined. Communism certainly was the ultimate expression of the ethical core, the idea that not only should we have equity, we should have equality, and a system based on a completely different system than the free market system is proposed here, where everyone would have a fair share. And for many years, I suppose you could say it was successful, although more recently you would see that less and less as communism is used less and less, and socialism more in favor. Week 2 is going to get into, in great depth, the duality or tension between free market views of the world and socialist views of the world in terms of how that will drive sustainability forward. I mentioned before that in this timeline, the quest for equity would continue. So, for example, the women's suffrage movement would come to a head in 1920. And it might be hard for some Americans to believe, but women couldn't even vote until those days. And the amount of suffrage, or the amount of sacrifice made to make this happen, was great on the part of many women, and obviously has laid the groundwork for a more equitable democracy as we've moved forward. By 1942, Mahatma Gandhi had come into play, another enlightened being, and certainly his life was dedicated to fighting for equity for those who've been marginalized by society. And this is a theme that will play out even greater in the 1960s. I mentioned before about our separation from the ethical core and the ability for humanity or groups of humans to rationalize abhorrent behavior. And so when we think about, for example, the Holocaust might be one of the most horrific examples of the ability of humans to create artificial differences based on ethnicity or color or any other kind of way to justify one group over another. Unfortunately, this Holocaust was not the last. There was more to come in Rwanda and Cambodia in the future. But certainly that and the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan represented really great leaps, and I don't mean great and good, great leaps in the ability for humanity to create widespread destruction and suffering amongst other people. Now, the argument's been made, of course, that the U.S. dropping the atomic bomb ended World War II more quickly and therefore saved lives. That's an ethical debate that continues to go on. Thankfully, and not surprisingly, humanity had probably got to its end and realized that it was time to do something different, and the United Nations was formed and still exists today. And certainly the UN would become very, very important in this concept that we're going to be talking about later called sustainability. Yes, we're getting there. Just be patient. But the United Nations is based on this idea of empathy, cognitive empathy, or care for individuals across the world, and for raising the quality of life in general of people around the world. And that will play out in a greater way later as we get through our story. We're still seeing examples again of one group of people being separated from another group of people based on either religion or ethnicity. The partitioning of India was another example of that, and that's still going on today. So this timeline is actually getting more and more complex. Interestingly enough, Hubert predicted peak oil in the U.S. by 1970, and on one level he was correct. On another level, he wasn't. And as we get into the last lecture, we'll see if the U.S. really did reach peak oil or not. And we'll be covering peak oil in great detail in week 4 for this course. And finally, at the end of this late age of industry, we get to the suburbs in the U.S., probably one of the greatest expressions of mass production, mass marketing, mass consumption, mass consumerism. We're talking about the widespread destruction of land in order to create more and more living arrangements for people. Just to be full disclosure, I live in the suburbs now, so I'm not completely demonizing it, but it certainly represented a certain point of view about nature and its value in society. So it's interesting to know that a lot of the U.S. suburbs where sites were basically cleared and new houses were placed that looked one just like the other. And we get into a position where boredom might set in, visual boredom, but certainly the impact on the environment was pretty great, and certainly the impact on energy use, as we'll see later, was really very high. At this point, though, oil and gas was plentiful, so it's not unusual to understand why the suburbs happened or why it could happen. It made a lot of sense considering the price of gas and the price of oil and the ability for these resources to support this lifestyle. And with that, we're going to end this lecture, and we're going to get ready to move on to the next age.